Well, when it,
Sorry, Sarah, go ahead.
that's okay. I was gonna ask if it, when we live stream, it also records automatically.
It does, but the
Yeah.
live streaming is not working. Okay, welcome everyone. This is an ops section direction page Q&A. There's been a lot of updates to both the structure of the direction pages in general, so across dev, CI/CD, and ops pages, but also the ops one specifically, and we wanted to give everyone an opportunity to have a Q&A. There's an issue specifically for this discussion where we can have it async, but this is the synchronous opportunity to ask questions. I'll start. My name is Kenny Johnston. I'm the Director of Product Management covering the ops stages. I'll start with introductions of the product team, and then I'll do a brief overview of the content in both ops and monitor and configure stages, and then we'll open it up for questions. And there's a live notes doc you can find on that issue for anyone who wants to queue up questions as we go through. Okay, so as I said, Kenny Johnston, Director of Product for Ops, that covers configure and monitor. Daniel, why don't you introduce yourself, and then I'll pass it off to everybody else.
Yes, hi, this is Daniel. I am a product manager on the operations section, specifically in the configure stage, even more specifically on the orchestration group. So everything that deals with our DevOps, the Kubernetes integration is what we do here. And on to you, Sarah.
Thank you. My name's Sara Waldner. I'm a product manager within the monitor stage. My group is primarily responsible for the resolve and triage experiences within operation, incident management, and response. And I'm going to pass it off to Dov.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, my name is Dov Hershkovitz. I'm also product manager in the monitoring stage. And my team is responsible for APM and the self-monitoring project.
And last is Victor.
Hello, so I'm Victor, and I'm on the configure stage in the system group as well as a product manager, just like the others before me. We are responsible for our serverless infrastructure as code, chatops, and runbooks offerings.
Cool, thanks. I will share my screen, and I want to jump through the ops section direction page here quickly. Okay, and now I lost my Zoom window, but okay, that's all right. Okay, so the ops section, these vision pages are structured with kind of an overview of kind of like defining what we mean by the section, giving a little bit of a market overview, then going through challenges and opportunities, and then covering a couple of themes, including some items that are kind of like examples of what we might pursue as a result of that theme. And then a 3-year strategy and a what's next that's meant to cover kind of like our immediate next year viewpoint. These are documents that were recently created over the last 3 or 4 months, but are meant to be, as all things GitLab, highly iterative. So I think there's been, 5 to 6 MRs over the course of the last couple of months. I'd love to see that increase. So I would encourage other team members to contribute to MRs. But the overview is, I'll give my TLDR from the top of my head. So apologies if I'm not exact on these numbers, but the ops tool market is large. It's actually, in some cases, larger than the dev tool market because there's more mature tools. I think in general, there's some feeling that the ops side of the kind of total DevOps market requires some significantly higher R&D investment to build those tools because you're dealing with larger data sets. And so there seems to be a premium that people are willing to pay. There's also a component of, especially in the monitor space, there's a higher overall market, likely because you're also paying for the raw storage costs in these tools. So when you have SaaS tools like Datadog or New Relic, where they're storing data in a SaaS solution for you, you're also at kind of having to bundle in this higher infrastructure cost of actually storing the raw content of your metrics that you're monitoring. So that leads to the market kind of having a higher premium, I guess you can think of it as. Players in this space, as I mentioned, are clearly in the monitor stage. There are consolidating vendors. Splunk has bought VictorOps, and another synthetic monitoring tool that I'm forgetting the name of, Signal FX, I think it was recently. So there's consolidation in that market around the players moving to this one ops tool kind of world. In the configure stage, Victor and I were actually just talking about this today. It seems to be more fragmented. There are some tools that are becoming at least the new style of configuration management tool. HashiCorp and their tool set, including Terraform, comes to mind. But there are also a kind of split of the former generation of tools of Puppet, Chef, and Ansible that people use for configuration management. And in general, the connection between management of infrastructure and applications is becoming more blurred, where you see things like infrastructure as code, where you're managing that infrastructure like it was code. So the tooling for managing infrastructure is changing more to look like developer tooling. We talked about our customers do utilize blah, blah. This next statement is kind of how our current customers are using it. I would say our vision for the ops stage overall is that GitLab becomes the first tool that operations professionals or people who are responsible for operating applications in production environments look at when they wake up in the morning. I don't think we're there yet. Customers tend to use us more for the, there's like a direct quote that we heard from a customer that, hey, I use New Relic for most of my applications, but if there's a new greenfield application that's cloud native and can utilize Prometheus, then I might save a couple bucks on my New Relic costs by not having to use it. So our adoption in these stages is, I would call it, nascent. There's significant opportunities for us to grow here. Some of the challenges, existing players with a lot of R&D investment, and I put one other here that I would just highlight that we don't have as much dogfooding in this space as we do in others, obviously, because we have a ton of developers and our operations team are not using our operations tooling, at least not to the rate that we'd like. So our pace of learning is slower. I think that's a challenge that we'll talk about later. Some opportunities, my kind of TLDR on this opportunities is there's definitely a market realization that developers are kind of the kingmakers in these tooling, and that we're asking developers in this DevOps world to own more of the operations process. And so the developer buying power is increasing, and as a result, you have people who don't have as much pure operation skills available to do pure operations. And so there's kind of this notion of how do you teach developers to do some of these operations tasks and how do you enable them to do that well. That means that a developer-focused ops tool kind of like has a clear path for success in this market. We have some consolidation in how people do operations because of the adoption of Kubernetes. So that means that we were an early adopter of Kubernetes, and we frequently hear this quote that GitLab is the most common way to deploy to Kubernetes because we make it very easy and integrated. And that means that if we kind of lean into that, we can continue our lead in the operations space as well. And then, our roots in source control management means that the infrastructure as code evolution that is going on in this space has the potential to benefit us, and there are things that our customers already do. You heard on stage at London Commit, where there are a number of customers talking about how they were using GitLab to manage their infrastructure. So a clear opportunity for us to lean in. Themes that we've defined are this, again, leaning into source control. How do we define both the infrastructure that my application is being deployed to, the application itself, obviously, and the observability or like my response systems in code? I think that is a clear thing that we want to emphasize, again, with our roots in source control management and our kind of like robust CI/CD capabilities, means that we can and should be early proponents of this infrastructure and observability as code market push. We talked about observability. And the other one is the feedback loop, right? I think from an operations perspective, we also have the potential to get you started with the most important, Victor and I were talking about this, like the most important metrics to be alerted on for you as a developer who's not staring at a screen in a NOC all day, to know like, oh man, I got to respond to this, but then give you tools so that you can triage it quickly, but also build your ability to triage the next one. So have this feedback loop that as you're learning how your system responds and fails, that you can develop new tools so that you can better respond to its failure in the future. And that iteration cycle of saying I'm learning something from my incident and then pushing that back as code to the things that I've defined is kind of critical, and obviously speaks to our general DevOps lifecycle of cycle time and iteration is really critical. And then operations for all, which is really, I'd mentioned this earlier, like starting from the developer and building tools that enable the developer to do operations that doesn't require this kind of like dedicated, you hear about large software companies that have dedicated infrastructure cost managers or site reliability engineers or these other kind of specialized functions that we really want to focus on the developer first and enabling the developer to handle these tasks. And then this last one is really about a growing trend. Not the industry calls it no ops. It's a little bit of a misnomer. There's still a bunch of operations tasks that need to be done, but you're requiring less direct infrastructure management as a result of things like serverless and some other initiatives. I think our auto DevOps is kind of a step in that direction, just in general. 3-year strategy, we talk about being this kind of consolidating around Kubernetes, being the place where infrastructure professionals land on a daily basis. There's a notion of supporting a team that provides the infrastructure as like a platform team. This is something we've been hearing a lot from analysts, that there are this new notion that platform teams might kind of serve as the internal paths for development teams, so that for instance, Kubernetes infrastructure is run by the platform team, and then the developer teams land their applications on that infrastructure, so they don't have to think about it as much. And then, yeah, the whole infrastructure and observability as code, that those processes are defined and have CI/CD capabilities. In the next 12 months for ops, we talk about most important dogfooding, building our logging capabilities. We really want to work on the dashboarding for the purposes of triage and instrumentation. So again, I think the notion that people will stare at a knock at a big screen and only when they see something go blip realize that something's wrong is out the window today in modern operations lexicon. But really, you need some visualization in order to instrument where you want to be alerted, and then when you are alerted, to triage that. Incident management gives us a high focus on that feedback loop. So focusing on how do you learn from an incident and put those changes back into code. And then, as we said, infrastructure as code. We talk about a couple of things that we won't invest in, which is one, this notion that individuals will attach their own personalized Kubernetes cluster to a project. We want to focus more on that platform user. We want to focus more on the ability to have smart alerts that then can be iterated over time. So that, like, out of the box, I'm immediately going to have a bunch of metrics for a whole bunch of specific applications. We're going to focus less on that. And then the app instrumentation across some legacy programming languages. We're focused on skating where the puck is headed. So there are a set of languages that are the more modern set that are used to deploy cloud native applications that we should focus on, making it easy to instrument first and foremost. The rest is kind of our roadmap for the items, but hopefully that gave you a good verbal overview of this page. And I will stop for questions or comments. I'm going to pull up that page real quick. Seth, want to verbalize your question?
Sure. So this is specific to, I guess, Monitor. So my question is, as we build out our features over the next 3 years, and we're trying to build them out to maturity and scale that can compete with the top players today. Do you see any challenges with pricing? I know that the way we have it structured right now means that we don't have to store customer data for the monitoring features, but if that changes in the future, that could be a huge cost to us for our .com offering. So I guess I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that and how our current pricing model would have to change.
Yeah, I'll give my thoughts, and then Sarah and Dove, if you want to add. Like, I would just say, I think you're spot on. I would posit that in some future world we do have in .com a SaaS-based offering that includes the bundling of storage in some centralized way, and that we charge for that similar to how we charge for CI minutes. Like, with your plans, you get a certain set number, and then if you have overages, there's a way to purchase overages. I will say that pricing mechanics is also, because the majority of our business comes from self-managed, is a little bit of a differentiator, because today, again, like our product, if their developers are using it, comes bundled with all these other tools that their developers are using, and then their internal teams get to manage the cost of that storage, and there's no premium on top of the software cost for it. So there's a little bit of, like, it's kind of what we're approaching this in the less SaaS way. But I do think that there's an opportunity there, because our pricing will look really good compared to the other players in the space. But I think for .com, we would certainly want to be in a position where we'd have some other SKU price point for overages. Dove, Sarah?
Yeah, I think you're, at least from my side, I think your response is spot on. We'll definitely need to do some changes on the pricing in .com as we introduce even Elasticsearch, and we want to store metrics. I don't see it as a challenge. I see it as an opportunity, actually. And I guess this is something that we need to start planning. I mean, yeah.
I'd be curious, I don't know if this is an answer to this question or an agreement that this will be challenging. But we base a lot of our functionality in the monitor stage on integrations with other platforms. And while the overall goal is to use said other platform as kind of the bones and running infrastructure for the product that we provide in GitLab, how do we handle what features we choose to integrate with, especially if those fall to, if another product has a 3 or 4 tiered pricing system, we have the same. So instead of just mapping to our own 4 pricing tiers between core and ultimate, we're now also having to make a choice and have an opinion on which platforms within this other tool our users also have to have. So I see challenges with pricing from that perspective. As we try to move quickly and meet other vendors in market, it's going to be helpful if we can lean on work done by other tools. But if we're not owning it, we're now at their whim for what they choose to price for that. That makes sense?
Yeah, and I think maybe you're specifically, a specific example of that is Sentry. Like,
yeah.
Do our users who integrate with Sentry need to buy the premium or enterprise version of Sentry? Ideally, I think the answer would be no, but like, I think they're also hosting data there. It'd be hard for someone to not have some place to store all their Sentry related errors. So. Cool, Victor.
Yes, so you mentioned a few times that we are actually a leader in the Kubernetes deployment. So I totally understand that we are a leader in terms of technology, that we're one of the first people to make it easy. It might lead us quite some usage as well. So the question is, do we know actually how many weekly or daily deployments there are of Kubernetes?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll say I asked the source of that quote originally, and I think it was from a talk that Kelsey Hightower gave. Just from his experience, he's seen that a lot of people who are deploying to Kubernetes are using GitLab because of our integration. Makes it fairly easy, and like there are out-of-the-box pipelines for it. But Daniel, I don't know if you can comment on. We also have metrics of how many Kubernetes deploy clusters are getting attached to our instances from usage ping and other sources.
That's right. So we have visibility in 2 ways. So the first one is the number of clusters that are being created within GitLab, be that in GKE or you're adding an existing cluster from another platform. That's the first one. And then the second one is the total number of auto DevOps pipelines. And there's bit of a challenge there because in auto DevOps, we don't really segment it by stage on our metrics, right? We know it's an auto DevOps pipeline, but we currently don't know which stages of that pipeline, let's say you chose to ignore or you didn't execute on. So one of the that's going to be one of our themes in Configure, I think, for next year is going to have more sophisticated telemetry. So for example, we say we have a certain number of auto DevOps pipelines that may or may not deploy to Kubernetes, right? Because that deploy part is only available if you have a cluster attached to your project group or instance. And there may be other things where if you're using composable auto DevOps, we don't really have a metric for how many times a certain template is being called. So that's going to be another thing that we are going to add telemetry to. But roughly, I can tell you that over the past year, on average, we've had about just shy of 1 million pipelines in auto DevOps that run monthly. And I'm looking at the most recent month, and that is around 700,000 for the month of September. So we can't assume that all of those have deployed to Kubernetes, but we know that probably a large number have. So we'll work to kind of add that level of detail to the metrics.
Cool. Daniel, do you mind adding that Periscope dashboard to the Google Doc, Notes Google Doc?
Sure thing.
Thanks. Jean, sorry.
John, that's fine.
Thanks, John.
So considering we're trying to enable teams that might not have deep knowledge of operations because of the skill shortage, what role should a user-friendly and rich GUI play in our strategy, and at what stage in the maturity lifecycle should it possibly become a focus?
Yeah, actually, so Sara and I had a really interesting conversation with an analyst on Friday about the need for, there's a new movement in this space. So some of us attended Monotorama in June and heard from a guy named John Allspaw who spoke about a new discipline called human factors engineering, which is really about how do we help humans understand complex systems. That's especially useful. I mean, it's useful in a lot of different industries, including like military and others, but especially useful when under highly stressed environments like doing incident triage and resolution. And that typically the tools we have today take the machine's data structure, for lack of a better word, when presenting it for humans. But if we start from the goal of it's important for humans to be able to quickly understand this complex system and how it is failing in a complex manner, we can think about new UI experiences that would enable that. So I know a number of team members have come from organizations that have done this and have tooling to do it, so I'd love to give them an opportunity to speak. But I do think you're spot on, Gene, that the importance is even higher because we're talking about professionals that don't have deep operations experience, and we need to give them as part of their workflow of understanding, even before triaging, an ability to quickly understand this complex system that like a 12-factor cloud-native application that has tons of different subservices is a very complex system that we need to give people tooling, and that will likely mean visualization to help them understand. But again, others can contribute. I know lots of people have come from companies that have done this exact thing. Aaron and Sara, I'm thinking of you guys. No?
Aaron, did you want to hop in? Okay, so I think we were both pausing for each other. Go for it.
Sorry,
Just kidding. Oh my God.
Yeah, I think it's really important. It's not easy, but it's definitely doable. And I think as we start to eventually broaden the scope of the customers we're trying to go into, especially like as you go into enterprise, and a lot of the users in the enterprise space are very siloed in what they're allowed to do. It's important to give them more than enough context so they can understand the broader impact of what they're looking at, what they're working on. So I think having an interface that easily explains the complexities of what we're looking at is very important.
I think that also aids us in companies who come to us with the purpose of I'm going to use GitLab because it's going to help me with my DevOps transformation, versus those that come that are already more progressive aren't necessarily, they're going to enjoy and find use in this. But those that we can make that configuration or instrumentation more accessible to, I think is where we have huge opportunity at this time. And I have another comment for the other part of this strategy, which is, and Kenny, correct me if you are thinking about this differently, but we'll always start with providing all of the information or enabling instrumentation via configuration versus a really rich GUI, as that will take longer to build, and we can learn more from providing people with fundamental basic tools and then adding on top of that an interface that makes it easier or increases our reach to different types of people within a company.
Yeah, I think, I don't know. I think to the extent that we're targeting this group of people who don't have a lot of experience with those tools. Let's take the how do I configure alerting example, right? Like today, I think we started with that primarily in GUI, right? And I don't think that was an important step to take because it shows people that, hey, you're looking at a graph and you can add an alert to it. So some of those workflows feel like they should be user interface centric. Obviously, we have to iterate, or we're not going to like all of a sudden bang land some revolutionary new interface. We have to think about how to iterate through that, and maybe there are cases where that configuration, less graphical configuration, is a starting point. But I guess I would also, I think that my current understanding of that is not complete. If you were to tell me, hey, developers only wants to do configuration in text format, and that's their most comfortable thing, then maybe that's a place to start.
Sure. Yeah. I guess I just wanted to make one point. So, excuse me, I actually come from a really strong ops background, and I can tell you that even if the configuration of a particular component is not in the UI, if the docs and the entire UI UX experience is really clear, is really usable. If you look at companies like Datadog, like HashiCorp, everything is really tight. It looks really nice. It's really easy to use. It makes my job easier, makes finding the information that I need easier, getting started easier. So I think if we can that, and for people that aren't technical, they can dive into those, the setup, the quick starts a lot easier as well because like you mentioned, there are a lot of developers that are using these infrastructure as code frameworks to kind of get into ops. So if we can make that easier by providing a good UI UX, I think it's just a win-win.
Yeah, I would say that.
Sorry.
Maybe I could ask this question of the GitLab developers. We hear a lot that people love GitLab, right? And I think that they love GitLab because it's comprehensive and because the user experience is friendly, intuitive, organized for the way that their brain is thinking. I know we're always our harshest critic, and we know we have work to do in our user experience, but we still get like above industry average scores, and I hear developers talk about how they love our tool. I'd like to emulate that same thing in the ops world, primarily that those commentary is about our developer-centric, like our developer stages of the tool. I'd like to emulate that same thing in the ops world. I don't know if that necessarily exactly equates to it has to be graphical user interface, but I want people to love our tool.
I want to just maybe come back to the second part of my question, which was, let's assume a rich graphical user interface is essential to the ops stage. At what kind of like maturity level if we look at GitLab's kind of like a scale of a 7-year to maturity levels to become kind of like best product in market, at which stage should we kind of like switch to a bit more of an acute focus on the GUI then? You know, if you look at something like configure, which is considered at a kind of like a year 3 maturity, you know, do we wait till we get to the point where we want to be an entry point for new customers, or best product in market, or even earlier? You know, do you usable for most users of GitLab? So I'm trying to gauge more or less at what part of the evolution of our ops offering would we want to kind of like start pushing the GUI a bit, if it is a strategic element of it.
Yeah, it's a great way of framing it. I mean, my immediate response is now, but I don't know, like, I guess I don't, there seems to be a starting point of that we've maybe like short shifted our GUI capabilities to date. And to the extent that we have done that, I think we probably need to adjust. But I mean, our experience to date isn't horrible, but I think it's not focused on getting someone to understand the system. So sorry, my brain is now going through like, how do we adjust for that statement? Is there a component is there a category or workflow today that is just not as GUI friendly as we would want it to be that we invest in? Or is there a new category that's like, there's just a new thing that's like, understand the infrastructure system that would lead us down this path of here's the way of doing it?
I guess I will frame it in the sense of I'm coming from very little kind of like ops kind of like understanding and background. You know, I understand the concepts behind it and so on, but coming, you know, and I've been at GitLab 3 months now, so, and having to try and get used to the features of configure and all the functionality and stuff, I found it as a new user to be challenging. And so I'm thinking, you know, a rich GUI or something a little bit integrated might have made that experience easier. And I'm thinking, you know, like that might not be where we are in terms of our strategy yet with configure specifically that I focus on. So I'm more just kind of like trying to gauge it, as we grow configure, as we become, you know, at what stage do we say, you know what, at this point I'm not saying we shouldn't have a focus on it now already. I'm saying at what stage do we want to really, you know, make it a priority to create a user-friendly GUI? You know, like what for me feels potentially something that, you know, is around where we want it to be the entry point for new customers. You know, I'm making an assumption that a lot of our customers are potentially the ones that are a little bit more experienced in ops. And have the ability to do the configurations and stuff, and know what they're doing, and know what GitLab can offer them. But as a new customer, as an entry point for a new customer, to say, you know what, GitLab is offering me all this functionality, it makes it so much easier. I don't have to invest in the head count in my team to provide this kind of like technical skills to me. I can use GitLab for that. I'm thinking at that point you might need a fairly rich GUI to facilitate that.
Yeah. Okay. So let me break that into two things. One, the stage, like what stage are we in? I just want to like review. There are other stages other than configure that are like secure. For instance, last year, at the start of last year, was most of the categories were minimal. Defend is like one is minimal and the rest are still planned. Those are places where I could see the argument like, yeah, we really need to be focused on breadth here, and that kind of comprehensive workflow might not be as critical. I would think that configure is past that at this point, right? Like configure, we should be starting to think more about the user workflows and journeys, and if that means an investment more in. Yeah, and I think I'm stuck because I'm not sure where improved UX would improve that flow. But if you have specific points where, like you just said, you've been onboarding and trying to understand if those are current pain points, we should be tracking those and working with the product team to knock them out. So yeah, I'll go back to your original question. It's like when. I think now is when. We shouldn't be Daniel and Victor are in charge of prioritization for those teams, so I'm sure there are tough decisions to be made, but we should be continually bringing those up. And I know Auto DevOps has seen just the like workflow of getting started with an Auto DevOps project has seen a lot of emphasis of doing speed runs and walkthroughs and other things to make sure that user experience is as robust and simple as possible. And it's improved a lot in my 10 months here.
I think from my standpoint, as far as like the rich UI goes, like there's varying degrees of that. And for when we start to optimize for those jobs to be done, like Kenny mentioned, like our customers are going to dictate some of that. You know, when we start to work on those things and optimize those workflows, you know, we're going to go out and talk to them and validate, you know, our solutions, you know, as we go along. But when we decide to invest in those, I think our customers should have a voice in that, and you know, tell us when something's not working, or they need us to start to like really optimize and dig in on something specific, right?
Cool. I think it's a great point, and there's another component that's just we have to think about. Oh, if we want that improved experience, it comes through iteration, right? And so we have to make sure we're thinking through what are the individualized next steps that can lead us there. The notion of like a rich graphical user interface feels like it's the kind of thing that you would normally like go work in a silo for 3 months and develop and then like spring on the application, but that's just not how we work here. So I think there's a challenge in that, like, oh, I want to rethink how users interact with this certain workflow. It's hard to take that in iterative steps. It's harder than other types of like feature related work. Cool. Other questions?
I wanted to add to that last point that I think that audience is important there. So a lot of the features that we're going to work on and are currently working on have an audience that like heavily relies on version control to manage pretty much everything, from pipelines to infrastructure to rules to alerts. All of that is generally version control. I think that the monitoring aspect has big reliance on dashboards and things like that, but I don't think that rich graphical GUI should be the first thing in many of the features that we're going to work on. That being said, because we want to be kind of the solution to deploy to Kubernetes for first-time users, that's going to be important. But I think that the overall experience to people that are in that role or in that business today of doing operations is going to be more important.
Cool. Thanks, Daniel. All right. If no other questions, you can feel free to ask additional questions in the issue, or there's an ops section Slack channel. Feel free to jump in there. I think what I would also love to see is this document is not like something that product management like plops down and is the gospel. Like, please contribute MRs, updates, we can have a discussion. There's a couple of points from today's conversation that I'm going to use to update the document, but it's meant to be our method of communicating, especially within the ops section, kind of like what our current plans and strategy are that every team member can refer to. And if we can hash out questions or debates or discussions in MRs to that document. So please consider it a living and breathing thing. Cool. If nothing else, I appreciated the discussion. This was awesome. And I will see you all soon.